"You're trespassing on HOA property," the young man screamed, his voice cracking like a whip over the calm lake water, while a gull squawked somewhere above us as if mocking his confidence. The morning sun shimmered on the surface, scattering gold on ripples that barely moved, yet this fool was shaking like a man who'd found himself in the wrong movie. His mother stood behind him in her floral robe, arms crossed, lips pursed so tight it looked like she was trying to whistle her own bad decisions away. I leaned against the porch railing of my own cabin, sipping coffee from a chipped mug that had survived 2 divorces, 3 elections, and 1 bear encounter. I didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even raise my voice. I simply said, "Son, you're yelling at the county sheriff." That was the moment the world went quiet. Even the gull shut up. For 10 seconds, all you could hear was the slow creak of the dock and the lake breathing against the shore, and I watched the realization crawl across his face like a snail with bad news. That was the hook, the moment everything that followed would spiral into pure small-town chaos dressed up as law and order and motherly entitlement. He didn't know who he was messing with, and that made this story worth telling. That morning had started like any other. I'd woken to the soft sound of waves hitting the old wooden dock, the smell of pine drifting through the cracked window of my cabin, and the gentle hum of the coffee pot sputtering to life. The lake was glass smooth, the sky clear enough to count contrails. I'd been planning to fix the old fence that separated my property from the HOA development that had sprouted like weeds over the past 5 years. It used to be quiet here. Fishermen, locals, the occasional weekend cabin renter. Then came the HOA. They'd paved over the gravel trail, installed signs that said "private access" on land that had never belonged to them, and sent newsletters that treated the lake like their private pond. Most of the old locals ignored them. I didn't. Especially when they started targeting my cabin as some sort of unregistered occupant zone. Apparently, the HOA's map ended where their arrogance began. Karen moved in last summer, loud as a marching band, full of rules that didn't apply to her. Her son, fresh out of college with too much energy and too little sense, called himself the acting vice president of property relations. Whatever that meant, he took it seriously. Too seriously. That morning he'd marched up to my dock with his clipboard, sunglasses, and attitude, backed by his mother who filmed everything like she was auditioning for reality TV. "Sir, this property line belongs to the Lakeview HOA," he declared, pointing at a faded stake near the dock that I had hammered into the ground 20 years ago myself. I asked him calmly if he'd like to see the original deed from my grandfather, who built this cabin before their precious HOA even existed. He smirked and said, "That's irrelevant, sir. The association has redefined the zoning." I nearly spat my coffee laughing. "Redefined the zoning?" I asked. "Did you redraw the map with crayons or crayons and confidence?" That made his mother gasp like I'd insulted the Constitution. He puffed his chest and stepped closer, saying, "Sir, I'm asking you to vacate this property immediately until the HOA board can confirm ownership." That was when I gave him the line he'd never forget. "Son, you're yelling at the county sheriff." The silence afterward wasn't just awkward, it was glorious. Karen froze, her phone lowering slightly, her face turning a shade somewhere between ghost white and HOA beige. The son blinked twice, then forced a laugh, trying to recover. "Well, that doesn't change the property law, does it?" he muttered weakly. I took a slow sip of coffee and said, "It changes who writes the report, though." He didn't like that. He started muttering something about filing complaints, about misuse of power, about cabin squatters. His mother jumped in, waving her phone, shouting that she'd call the regional director of the HOA. I told her to go ahead and call anyone she liked, but make sure she used the right area code, because this wasn't HOA territory. They stormed off, their sandals slapping on the dock, leaving behind the smell of perfume and cheap authority. I watched them go, part amused, part curious how far they'd take it. The thing about people like them is they never stop at one argument. They build a mountain out of a molehill, then stand on it waving a flag that says, "We're the victims." I'd seen it before. They'd file some paperwork, hold a meeting, print a memo, each step pulling them deeper into their own nonsense. But this time, they'd picked the wrong land, the wrong man, and the wrong morning. Later that day, I found a notice taped to my front door. Immediate compliance request, unauthorized structure on HOA-managed property. It was written in fancy fonts, like a wedding invitation to stupidity. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my sandwich. They had officially declared my cabin, built in 1958, registered in county records, with a septic tank I installed myself, an unauthorized structure. The notice threatened fines, community enforcement action, and something called temporary access restriction. I figured that meant they planned to block the road that led to my driveway. Cute idea. I made a note to check the gate later. Around sunset, my old friend Ray stopped by. He's the county surveyor, a man who's been measuring land around here since before GPS. I showed him the notice, and he nearly choked on his coffee. "They tried this with Old Man Henderson's dock last year," he said, shaking his head. "They don't read deeds, they read Facebook posts." He offered to pull the official boundary maps from the county records just to humor me. "But you already know what it'll say," he added. I did. The line of ownership ran 50 yards past the HOA's so-called boundary markers, putting their entire lake access zone technically on my family's land. That was the punchline they hadn't learned yet. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the lake turned to molten gold. I sat back on my porch, boots on the railing, watching dragonflies hover over the water. My phone buzzed, an email from the HOA. Subject line: Urgent violation notice. I didn't even open it. I knew what was coming. Meetings. Accusations. Maybe even a police call. The irony of them calling the cops on me, the sheriff, made me grin. Sometimes life serves you comedy without asking. I poured another cup of coffee, leaned back, and whispered to no one, "This lake's about to get real loud." That night, I left the porch light on. I wasn't expecting trouble yet, but I could feel it brewing. Karen's son wasn't the type to back down. He'd come back, probably with more papers, maybe even more people. But I was ready. I'd seen worse. Drunk fishermen, land feuds, border arguments, even a moose that tried to join a picnic once. Compared to that, an HOA tantrum was almost fun. The stars came out, the water turned black and glassy, and I could hear faint voices across the lake where the HOA houses clustered like cardboard cutout. I smiled, because I knew they were talking about me, and they had no idea the storm they'd started. The calm before the chaos. The quiet before the headlines. They'd picked the wrong sheriff to mess with, and by the time they realized it, the lake itself would tell the story. The next morning began with the sound of tires on gravel and voices that didn't belong by my lake. I stepped out onto the porch and saw 3 SUVs parked crookedly near my gate, all shiny and city-clean, with HOA stickers slapped proudly on their bumpers like badges of bad judgment. A folding table had been set up near the trail, complete with clipboards, coffee cups, and a little banner that read HOA Boundary Review Committee. I nearly spit my coffee. It looked like a yard sale for arrogance. Karen was there, of course, her floral robe replaced with a business blazer she must have pulled out of a motivational seminar. Her son stood beside her, holding a rolled-up blueprint like he'd just discovered cartography. I could hear snippets of their conversation, phrases like illegal encroachment, community standards, and lake zoning violations. It was the kind of bureaucratic babble people use when they've run out of real words. I walked down to the gate, leaned on the post, and said, "Morning. You planning to sell lemonade or just rewrite property law again?" Karen didn't laugh. She turned to her son, gave a dramatic sigh, and said loudly, "See? This is exactly the hostility the HOA is dealing with." He puffed his chest and held up the blueprint. "Sir, this document clearly shows the lakefront property as shared community access under HOA jurisdiction." I looked at it. Crayon blue lines, printed names, no county seal. I asked, Did you print that off Pinterest? That earned me a glare so sharp it could have filed nails. They wanted a confrontation, but I wasn't giving them one. I smiled, waved my mug slightly, and said, "Well, good luck with your review committee. Don't forget sunscreen." Then I turned back toward my cabin, slow and calm, just to make them mad. It worked. Behind me I heard Karen hissing something about non-compliance notices and potential legal escalation. She was performing for her audience, 3 HOA board members who stood like backup singers in a choir of nonsense. I didn't turn around. I'd been sheriff long enough to know when to let someone hang themselves with their own rope. By afternoon, I got my first official letter, hand-delivered by a teenager wearing a neon HOA volunteer badge like it was a medal. The envelope said, "Formal notice of violation." Inside was a full-page document filled with legal jargon that sounded like someone had copy-pasted from a lawyer's website at midnight. It claimed I had erected an unauthorized dwelling within the limits of Lakeview's designated recreation area, and that I was to cease occupation until the matter is reviewed by the HOA board. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. I was the sheriff of the county, the cabin was older than their entire development, and they were acting like I'd squatted on their resort. I pinned the letter to the corkboard next to my fishing schedule, right between replace porch bulb and check dock ropes. That's about how serious I took it. That evening, I stopped by the local diner, where gossip traveled faster than cell service. Folks had already heard the story. Old Ben, who ran the bait shop, slapped my shoulder and said, "Heard Karen's boy tried to evict the sheriff." I thought it was April Fool's. Even the waitress, Tina, leaned over the counter and whispered, "You gonna arrest her for stupidity, or is that still legal?" I grinned and told them, "Not yet. I'm collecting evidence." And I was. Not because I needed to, but because I knew how HOA disputes worked. They escalated quietly, paper by paper, meeting by meeting, until suddenly someone thought they had power. So I wanted everything on record. Every notice, every letter, every ridiculous claim. If they were going to dig a hole, I'd hand them the shovel and make sure they hit bedrock. 2 days later, the Lakeview HOA special meeting was announced. It wasn't hard to find out. They posted it on their little Facebook group, which was public. The agenda. Item number 3. Unlawful occupancy of lakefront parcel by non-HOA resident. Non-HOA resident. That was me. They were holding a meeting to discuss evicting the sheriff from his own land. You couldn't write comedy this good. I decided to attend. I wore plain jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt, no badge, no belt, nothing official. The meeting was held in their clubhouse, a new building that looked fancy from the outside but smelled like wet paint and cheap promises. About 30 people sat in plastic chairs, murmuring like it was Sunday service. Karen sat at the front behind a folding table with a microphone, her son beside her flipping through papers. When I walked in, the room went quiet. A few folks nodded politely. They knew me from town. Others whispered like kids caught cheating. Karen smiled, that fake, stretched smile people wear before they throw a punch. "Oh, Sheriff," she said sweetly into the mic, "thank you for joining us. We're just discussing a matter concerning, well, your residents." I sat in the back and said, "I figured I'd listen in. Always good to stay informed about my own eviction." A ripple of nervous laughter spread across the room. Her son stood up, posture perfect, trying to sound professional. "After reviewing the 2024 HOA boundary updates," he said, "it's been determined that your cabin falls within the Lakeview community's jurisdiction." I raised a hand and said, "Quick question, who determined that?" He blinked. "The board did," he replied confidently. "Ah," I said, "so you appointed yourselves as surveyors, assessors, and judges. Efficient." The room chuckled. He turned red. They went on for nearly half an hour, showing slides, quoting bylaws, even projecting a PowerPoint map that had more colors than a kindergarten art project. When they were done, Karen said dramatically, "We're asking for voluntary cooperation before legal action becomes necessary." I nodded slowly. Voluntary cooperation, huh? Tell you what, I'll bring the original county deeds tomorrow. If they show what I think they'll show, you'll want to hold another meeting, one about trespassing." Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, pretending confidence for the crowd. "We'll look forward to clarifying this," she said, but her eyes told another story. The next day, I called Ray again, and he dropped off the official parcel maps, stamped and dated by the county office. They showed everything clear as crystal. The lake's north section, including the HOA's community dock and part of their access trail, sat on my family's original parcel. The HOA's blueprints weren't just wrong, they were illegal. I didn't rush to show them yet. I wanted them to go further, to send one more notice, one more claim, one more step into the pit they were digging. Sure enough, by the end of the week, they'd escalated again. A fresh notice appeared, final warning before enforcement action. Enforcement. That word made me chuckle. HOA enforcement meant a couple of retirees with clipboards and bad tempers showing up to yell about fences. But I knew where this was heading. They'd call the county, maybe even try to file something official. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. That night, I sat on my porch watching the moon ripple across the lake. The air smelled like pine and quiet revenge. I thought about my father and grandfather, both lawmen, both owners of this same land, both men who'd believed that patience was sharper than any weapon. Let them make their noise, I thought. Let them believe they're winning. Because when the truth hits, it'll hit like thunder. Out there across the water, I could see the glow from the HOA clubhouse. Maybe they were having another meeting, maybe they were celebrating their fake victory. Either way, I smiled, finished my coffee, and whispered to the darkness, "They don't know it yet, but the sheriff's just getting started." The third night after their meeting was when things started to get strange. It was around midnight. The lake was calm enough to hear the frogs croaking on the far shore, and the air carried that heavy silence that only exists when something is about to happen. I was half asleep on the porch with my boots up and a lantern flickering low when I heard it, the sound of metal clinking. It was faint but sharp, the kind of noise that doesn't belong in the woods at that hour. I turned off the lantern and listened. There it was again. A hammer. Someone was hammering near the dock. I stayed still for a moment, waiting to be sure it wasn't just the echo of a drifting boat chain, but then came the scraping of a shovel and a muttered curse. That was no animal. I slipped on my jacket, grabbed the flashlight, and moved quietly through the trees toward the lake. The moon was bright enough to see shapes without giving myself away, and down by the dock I saw them, two silhouettes. One tall, one shorter, both wearing reflective vests like they were on some official night mission. The shorter one was Karen's son. The tall one looked like the HOA's maintenance guy, Randy, a man who thought a toolbox gave him authority. They were digging near the old fence post and planting something shiny. I crept closer, boots silent on the wet soil, until I saw what they were doing. They were driving in new signs that read, HOA access only, private community property. The nerve of these people. I leaned against a tree, watching. The son whispered, "Make sure it's straight, Mom said it has to look official." Randy grunted and kept hammering. I almost laughed. They were staging a midnight takeover of land that wasn't theirs, under the assumption that no one would notice. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The flashlight stayed off, the phone camera catching just enough moonlight to show their faces and the signs. The sound of the hammering echoed across the still water, bouncing back like a warning bell. When they were done, they stood there admiring their work, two fake surveyors proud of their crime scene. "Tomorrow we'll put up the chain," the son said. "That'll block his road access. He'll have to go through the main gate after that, and once he does, he's under HOA jurisdiction." I almost applauded. The confidence was impressive, if not suicidal. They packed up, whispered something about "Mom will be proud," and headed back through the woods. I stayed in the shadows until their taillights vanished, then walked down to the fence. The new signs gleamed in the moonlight, shiny aluminum catching the reflection of the stars. I ran my hand across the letters, shook my head, and smiled. They had just committed vandalism, trespassing, and tampering with county property all in one night. That was what we call in law enforcement a clean trifecta. I didn't pull the signs out yet. Evidence, after all, works best when the guilty party doesn't know it exists. Instead, I took wide-angle photos, one with the lake behind it, one with the old deed marker visible in the background. I knew exactly how this was going to play out. They'd escalate, file a report, maybe even call the county office to complain about me, and when the time came, I'd have everything ready. I walked back to the cabin, the moon lighting the path, and for a moment I thought about my father's old saying, "Never wrestle with fools, son. Let them shout, let them sign, then let the law do the talking." The next morning, I brewed my coffee early, took a seat on the porch, and waited. Right on cue, Karen and her son came marching down the road around 9 a.m., dressed like they were leading a parade. She had a clipboard this time. He had a whistle hanging around his neck, and behind them were 2 HOA members with folding chairs. "Good morning, Sheriff," Karen said in that syrupy tone that only comes before something stupid. "We wanted to inform you that the association has officially established signage in accordance with our property boundaries." I took a sip and said, "You mean the ones you put up at midnight?" Her eyes flickered, just a second too long. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. Her son jumped in. "We followed all procedures. You can't remove them without HOA approval." I said, "That's funny, because the county hasn't approved anything, and last I checked, it's the county that decides property lines, not people with whistles." He turned red and muttered something about legal action again. Karen pulled out her phone and started filming, saying things like, "We are documenting harassment by a public official." I smiled, waved at the camera, and said, "Make sure you get the sign in the shot, it's evidence." That made her lower the phone for a second, confused, but she caught herself and doubled down. "We'll see you in court, Sheriff," she said. "Oh, I'm counting on it," I replied. They stomped off, chairs rattling, muttering about citations and board votes. As they disappeared up the road, I heard her son say, "Once we block the gate, he can't leave without HOA permission." I shook my head. They weren't just digging their own grave. They were building stairs into it. That afternoon, I called Ray again. He showed up with a clipboard, a measuring wheel, and a grin. "Heard they went nocturnal," he said. "Want me to measure where they planted the stupidity?" We walked down to the dock, and he started marking coordinates, humming to himself. "These signs are a good 25 yards inside your legal boundary," he said, "and here's the best part. They drilled into your property markers." "That's a felony, Sheriff." I nodded. "Yeah, I figured as much." We documented everything, took measurements, photos, timestamp. Ray even signed a verification statement on the spot. By the time he was done, I had enough proof to turn their fake boundary stunt into a full county investigation. But I wasn't ready to swing the hammer yet. People like Karen and her son don't learn through warnings. They learn through consequences that make the news. As night fell again, I noticed a new light flashing across the lake, a motion sensor they'd installed near their end of the shoreline. It was probably meant to monitor unauthorized access, meaning me. I couldn't help but chuckle. They were turning paranoia into an art form. Around 10, I saw a few of them with flashlights walking near the new signs, checking them like proud parents. I stayed in the dark, recording again. At one point, Karen's son looked across the lake and shouted, "We'll handle this legally." I shouted back, "I hope so, because illegal's not working out for you." The echo of my voice carried over the water, and I swear I heard someone trip on the rocks. By the third day, their campaign turned into full propaganda. Flyers started appearing on the neighborhood bulletin boards claiming, "Unauthorized occupant endangering community safety." They even posted on Facebook that a man claiming to be the sheriff was refusing to comply with HOA orders. I didn't even have to respond. The locals did it for me. Dozens of comments flooded their post, laughing, saying things like, "You picked the wrong lake," and "That cabin's been there since Eisenhower." The The humiliation started spreading faster than their paperwork. I could feel the pressure building. That's when I decided to set my own little trap. I called the county code office and requested an on-site review of recent HOA modifications. The officer who took my call knew me well. "You want us to check their signs and dock?" he asked. "Exactly," I said. "And maybe look into who authorized construction on county-owned land." He chuckled. "Copy that. I'll send someone next week." That was enough to start the avalanche. When the inspection notice reached them, they'd panic. When they panicked, they'd make mistakes. And when they made mistakes, I'd be right there with the camera. That night, sitting under the stars, I could see their lights flicking on and off across the lake, like fireflies powered by pure frustration. The wind carried faint echoes of voices. Karen shouting something, her son arguing back. Maybe they were blaming each other, maybe they were planning their next move. Either way, I knew the game had shifted. They thought they were tightening the noose around me, but they were really pulling it around their own neck. The signs gleamed faintly under the moonlight, those little metallic monuments to their arrogance. I took one last photo before heading inside, whispering under my breath, "Keep hammering, kids. You're building my case for me." The morning after their signs went up, the air had that heavy, waiting feel like the lake itself knew something was about to break. I'd barely finished my first cup of coffee when my phone buzzed with an email from the county clerk's office. It was Ray, and attached were the full digital parcel archives he'd promised. The original deed scans, zoning history, even the 1958 shoreline adjustment forms my grandfather had filed. Everything was right there, stamped, signed, official, unshakable. I opened each one slowly, smiling at the thought of Karen and her clipboard army trying to argue with half a century of county records. It wasn't just that my cabin was on the right side of the line. The documents showed something even better. When the county last reclassified the Lake District in the 70s, the HOA's current community recreation area had accidentally overlapped into our family's registered zone. That meant the land where they'd built their little dock, their pavilion, and even that fancy clubhouse sat technically on my parcel. I leaned back in my chair, laughed once, and whispered, "Well, this just got interesting." I printed out every page, 3 copies each, and slid them into a thick folder marked with one word, proof. After lunch, I took a drive into town, stopped by the county records office, and asked for official verification stamps on each document. The clerk, old Margaret, looked at me over her glasses and said, "So they're at it again, huh?" I grinned. "Worse than ever. But this time, they built their playground on my land." She chuckled, stamped the pages one by one, and said, "Make sure you bring popcorn to the fallout." I told her I planned to. Back at the lake, things were already heating up. From my porch I could see movement across the water, men in vests measuring things, taping off areas, even taking pictures like they were gathering evidence for a case. I couldn't help but admire their determination to lose a fight they didn't understand. By evening, a new email from the HOA popped into my inbox. Subject: Notice of impending legal action. I opened it, skimmed through paragraphs full of self-importance, and nearly laughed out loud when I read the last line. Failure to vacate may result in enforcement measures consistent with HOA bylaws. Bylaws. They were threatening the sheriff with bylaws. I didn't reply, not yet. Instead, I drove over to my friend Nate's office. Nate was a local lawyer, semi-retired but sharp as ever, the kind of man who could take one look at a document and smell weakness. When I handed him the folder, he whistled low. "Oh, they're done," he said. "These deeds are solid. If you wanted to, you could sue them for back usage fees on the entire dock." I smiled. "I don't want their money. I want their silence." Nate nodded knowingly. "Then you'll want a county injunction. It'll freeze any of their so-called enforcement until this is settled." He drafted the paperwork right there, tapping his pen against the desk as he read through the HOA's ridiculous claims. "They used the phrase, sovereign residential jurisdiction," he muttered. "That's not even a thing. Who wrote this? A committee of parrots." I laughed. Probably Karen's son. Nate grinned. Then this'll be fun. By the next afternoon, the official notice had been filed and sent. It required the HOA to cease any action until the property dispute was reviewed. I didn't announce it right away. I wanted them to find out naturally, like discovering they'd been driving on the wrong side of the road for months. Around 5 o'clock, while I was cleaning my fishing gear, I heard engines again. 2 SUVs pulled up, and this time it wasn't just Karen and her son, it was the full board. 5 people stepped out, all dressed like they were attending a courtroom drama, clutching papers, wearing that same expression of manufactured authority. Karen called out, "Sheriff, we'd like to speak with you formally." I set down the reel, wiped my hands, and said, "You're on my land. That formal enough for you?" That threw them off for half a beat, but she recovered. "We're here to inform you that the HOA board has voted unanimously to issue a temporary removal order pending legal clarification." I looked around theatrically, then back at her. "You brought the vote but forgot the jurisdiction. Let me save you the trouble, you don't have any." She frowned, her son stepped forward and said, "Sir, this kind of hostility isn't necessary. We're just trying to protect community property." I tilted my head. "You mean my property?" His lips tightened. "We'll see about that." That was when I handed them the envelope Nate had prepared. Karen opened it, skimmed the first page, and her face drained of color. Her son leaned over her shoulder, reading aloud, "Cease and desist. County injunction, pending property review." He stopped mid-sentence, realizing what it meant. I smiled and said, "That means your bylaws just lost a real law." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Karen tried to regain control, raising her chin. "This doesn't change anything. The board will appeal." I said calmly, "You go right ahead. Just make sure your next meeting is held somewhere you actually own." They left without another word, their little convoy kicking up dust as they drove off faster than they'd arrived. As the sun sank behind the trees, I walked down to the dock and looked across the lake. The reflection of their clubhouse shimmered in the orange light, looking peaceful, almost innocent. It was hard to believe that behind those walls, they were probably arguing about damage control, rewriting memos, maybe even planning their next move. But none of it mattered. The law was on my side, and now it wasn't just about boundaries. It was about principle. People like Karen believed rules were weapons, not guidelines. They wielded them at whoever stood in their way, thinking intimidation could rewrite truth. But truth has weight, and when you try to fight it, it doesn't budge, it buries you. That night, I called Ray again and asked him to come by the next morning. I wanted an official field inspection recorded under county supervision. He agreed, and when he arrived just after sunrise, clipboard in hand, he looked ready for a showdown. We walked the perimeter together, marking every illegal structure the HOA had built. Benches, a fence, even a small shed that crossed into my parcel line. Each time his measuring wheel clicked, I could almost hear another nail going into their legal coffin. He filed the report that same afternoon, complete with photos and GPS coordinate. That document alone could have flattened their entire case. 2 days later, the HOA tried one last desperate move. They called the county office to file a complaint against me, claiming I was abusing authority for personal land gain. The county forwarded the complaint straight to my department. My deputy handed me the file, smirking. "You want me to investigate yourself, boss?" I said, "Sure, I'll get right on it." The absurdity of it all would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. They were panicking now, scrambling for control. By the week's end, I'd built a complete dossier. Every notice, every photo, every legal document tied neatly together. It was more than evidence. It was a mirror, and when the time came to hold it up to them, they'd see their own arrogance staring back. That evening, sitting on the porch with the cicadas humming and the last streaks of daylight fading, I realized something. This wasn't just a property feud anymore. It was a lesson. They had built their HOA on entitlement, not community, and I was about to remind them that ownership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. The calm lake stretched out in front of me, still and knowing. The night breeze carried faint laughter from the far side, Karen's son, maybe, still pretending he had control. I smiled to myself, the weight of the deed folder resting on my lap like a promise. Tomorrow, I'd make the call that would turn their confidence into chaos. Tomorrow, the county would visit the HOA. Tomorrow, the law would speak louder than their bylaws ever could. The day the HOA held their Grand Lake party was the day their arrogance finally floated to the surface for everyone to see. I woke up to the sound of engines, laughter, and the faint hum of generators echoing across the water. When I stepped out onto my porch, the sight nearly made me choke on my coffee. They had set up tents, banners, food stalls, and speakers right there along the lakeshore, my lakeshore. Balloons swayed in the morning breeze, barbecue smoke curled up over the water, and a DJ was testing speakers loud enough to scare fish 3 miles away. There were coolers stacked by the dock, folding chairs lined up like an amphitheater, and a big white banner that read Lakeview HOA Annual Celebration. I rubbed my eyes and muttered, "Annual, huh? First one's about to be their last." Karen stood near the dock, dressed like the mayor of nonsense in a sun hat and pearls, barking orders through a megaphone. Her son strutted beside her in aviators and shorts, waving at arriving guests like a movie star. Every few minutes, he'd point toward my cabin, say something to the crowd, and they'd laugh. I didn't even need to hear it to know the kind of stories he was spinning. Something about me being a squatter or how the HOA was finally reclaiming community land. It was almost cute, watching them celebrate on land that wasn't theirs, totally unaware that every footstep, every cooler, and every rented chair was evidence of trespassing. By noon, the music was blasting. Boats filled with HOA members floated in the middle of the lake, kids splashed near my dock, and someone had the audacity to tie a rope to one of my dock posts to anchor their party raft. I could feel my patience thinning like fishing line about to snap. But anger wasn't the weapon I needed today, timing was. The county inspector, whom I'd called earlier that week, was scheduled to visit at 3 o'clock sharp for his site review. He had no idea he'd be walking into a full-blown festival of violations. I decided to wait it out, let them dig their hole deeper before handing them the shovel labeled law. Around 1 o'clock, I saw Karen's son marching toward my cabin with 2 men in tow, both wearing HOA polos and clipboards like cheap uniforms. He didn't even bother knocking. "Sheriff, we need you to vacate the dock area," he said, voice raised over the music. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You're holding a party on my property." He laughed, waved his hand dismissively, and said, "It's community land, and as acting event coordinator, I have full authorization." I gestured toward the water, where 3 boats were anchored on my shoreline. "You got authorization for those 2? He shrugged. "All within HOA limits." I smiled. "Well, good thing I called the county. We'll let them decide." He froze for half a second, then tried to recover. "You're bluffing," he said. I leaned against the railing. "Stick around until 3. You'll see." The next 2 hours were a circus. Music thumped, people danced, grills sizzled, and laughter echoed across the valley. Every now and then, a few partygoers would wander too close to my cabin, snapping photos like tourists. One even tried to set up a folding chair on my porch, thinking it was part of the event space. I politely pointed toward the sign that read "Private Property" and asked her if she could read. She scurried off. By the time the clock hit 3, I heard the distant crunch of tires on gravel. A white county vehicle pulled up beside the road, and out stepped the inspector, clipboard in hand, wearing a pair of mirrored sunglasses and an expression that screamed "I've seen everything." I met him halfway, shook his hand, and nodded toward the lake. "You're gonna want to take a look at this." He raised his eyebrows, scanning the chaos. "That's all HOA property?" he asked. "According to them," I said. "According to the county maps, it's mine." He whistled low. Well, this'll be fun. We walked down to the dock, and I let him lead, watching his pen scribble faster with each step. He noted the unpermitted structures, the extension cords running through wet grass, the grills placed too close to the shoreline, and the loudspeakers blasting music that could be heard from 3 counties over. Karen spotted us halfway through and came striding over, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "Excuse me," she said, "you can't just walk through our event without authorization." The inspector smiled politely. "Ma'am, I'm from the county zoning office. I have full authorization." Her smile cracked slightly, but she kept her voice firm. "We've filed our permits properly." He flipped his papers, nodded toward the dock, and said, "Funny, because none of these permits exist in county records. In fact, according to the land deeds, this entire section is private property." Her son came running up, breathless, saying, "That's wrong, we have new zoning from the HOA charter." The inspector chuckled, shaking his head. "The HOA doesn't write zoning law, son." I nearly laughed out loud. Karen started sputtering about community development and bylaws, her voice getting shriller with every sentence, while the inspector calmly wrote citation after citation. Then came the best part. The inspector pointed toward the pavilion they'd set up, a big canopy covering tables, coolers, and electric fans plugged into an extension cord that snaked across the dirt. "Who installed that?" he asked. Karen's son raised his hand proudly. "We did, as part of the community improvement project." The inspector nodded slowly. "That cord's connected to which power source?" The boy hesitated. "The main dock supply." The inspector followed it with his eyes, then turned toward me. "That your line?" I grinned. "Sure is." He scribbled another note and said, "So they're pulling power off your system without consent." Karen tried to protest, but he cut her off. "That's theft of service, ma'am. Also, unpermitted electrical installation near a water line. Both are violations." I swear, the color drained from her face so fast it could have powered their DJ booth. I stood there quietly, arms crossed, while her son started blaming Randy for handling the setup. Randy, standing by the grill, suddenly looked like he wanted to melt into the lake. The inspector took photos, measured distances, and made them sign acknowledgement forms before packing up. As he left, he turned to me and said, "Expect a full report by Monday. They'll be fined heavily." I nodded, trying not to smile too wide. When he drove off, the mood shifted instantly. The music stopped. Conversations turned to whispers. Karen's son stomped toward me, red-faced, shouting, "You did this! You embarrassed us in front of the whole community." I replied, "You embarrassed yourself. I just let the law do the talking." He threw his clipboard down, muttered something about retaliation, and stormed off toward the clubhouse. One by one, the partygoers packed up, their laughter replaced by awkward silence. Within an hour, the lake was quiet again, except for the distant sound of chairs folding and coolers slamming shut. I watched the last boat drift away, leaving the water rippling softly in the afternoon sun. The smoke from the grills hung low over the dock, mingling with the smell of defeat. As dusk settled, I sat back on my porch, boots propped up, watching the reflection of their empty pavilion swaying in the breeze. The lake was peaceful again, almost too peaceful, like it was exhaling after holding its breath all day. The air still carried a hint of burned charcoal and cheap victory speeches, but underneath it all was something sweeter, the quiet satisfaction of justice beginning to move. I knew this wasn't over. People like Karen and her son didn't retreat, they regrouped. But now, they weren't just fighting me. They were fighting county records, inspection reports, and legal documents signed in ink thicker than their pride. I poured another cup of coffee, the kind that tasted better after a long day of poetic justice, and looked across the water. Their lights were still on, but dimmer now, flickering like the last embers of a dying bonfire. I smiled to myself and whispered, "Party's over." By Monday morning, the storm they had created began to swallow them whole. I was sitting on the porch when the first county truck rolled up, dust swirling around its tires, followed by 2 more vehicles from zoning and environmental safety. The sound of their engines echoed across the still lake like a countdown to Judgment Day. I didn't have to do anything, I just watched. Karen and her son were already outside their clubhouse, their perfect posture and false confidence starting to sag as they realized these weren't HOA volunteers. They were county officials with clipboards, cameras, and authority that couldn't be argued away with a bylaw. From my seat, I could see the officials spreading out, taking measurements, snapping photos of the damaged shoreline, and marking red flags on the freshly installed HOA access signs that were still glinting in the morning light. Karen rushed forward waving papers, her voice shrill enough to wake every bird in the valley. I couldn't hear the exact words, but her arms moved like she was trying to physically stop the truth from existing. One of the inspectors held up a hand, calm and professional, and pointed toward my cabin. When she turned to see me watching, she froze for just a moment, that tight smile crumbling into a glare that could have curdled milk. I raised my coffee cup in a small salute. She didn't return it. The lead inspector approached my porch with a respectful nod and said, "Sheriff, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. It looks like you were right. The HOA has several unpermitted structures on land that legally belongs to you." I told him I'd suspected as much. He continued, "We're also filing a separate violation for illegal electrical connections and environmental damage. The generator runoff they dumped near the water counts as contamination." He handed me a copy of the initial report, and the satisfaction I felt wasn't about winning. It was about justice doing its slow, inevitable work. Across the lake, Karen's son was pacing, phone glued to his ear, probably calling every number in his contact list hoping someone could make this go away. But there are no calls that undo truth. There are no friends high enough to erase a deed. By noon, the inspectors had roped off half of their lakeside area, slapping bright orange under-county review notices on their dock and pavilion. A few HOA members stood nearby whispering like nervous witnesses at a trial, their loyalty already fading. Karen kept trying to corral them, calling for an emergency board meeting right there on the grass. She started speaking loudly, something about misunderstanding boundaries and clerical errors, but the inspector cut her off, explaining that ignorance of the law didn't make it disappear. Her face turned red, her son started shouting about harassment, and then one of the county workers stepped forward holding the surveyor's measurements. "This whole section," he said, pointing with a pen, "is about 38 yards over the legal boundary. That means your clubhouse, the dock, and part of your parking area are sitting squarely on the sheriff's private parcel." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I could see the moment it hit them, the dawning horror that every structure they'd bragged about, every improvement they'd boasted of, was technically an act of trespassing. The inspector started reading off potential penalties. Fines per day for unauthorized construction, retroactive land use fees, and possible demolition orders. Karen's son tried to argue, waving his phone like it was a sword. "We have the HOA charter. We have bylaws," he shouted. The inspector simply replied, "The county doesn't recognize HOA bylaws. They don't override property law." I almost felt sorry for him, standing there with his confidence melting away in the sun. Almost. But then I remembered the way he'd tried to humiliate me in front of my neighbors, the way he'd called me a squatter on my own land, and that pity evaporated faster than the morning dew. Around 3 o'clock, the county vehicles began to leave, leaving behind silence and a handful of orange flags marking the violations. The HOA crowd dispersed slowly, their faces a mix of confusion and embarrassment. Karen and her son retreated to the clubhouse, blinds snapping shut behind them like a fortress of denial. I leaned back in my chair, the report still in my hand, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was done, or at least the first part of it was. The law had spoken, and it had done so loudly enough that even the stubborn couldn't pretend not to hear. That night, I sat by the dock as the sky turned deep purple, the surface of the lake smooth as glass. The air felt lighter somehow, like the tension that had clung to every ripple was finally gone. But I knew better than to think they'd give up. People like Karen and her son don't accept defeat. They repackage it as conspiracy. Sure enough, around 9, headlights appeared near the clubhouse. Voices carried faintly across the water, angry, desperate, plotting. I could make out fragments. "We'll appeal. He set us up," the inspectors biased. It went on for an hour, words fueled by panic and pride, two poisons that never mix well. I didn't bother confronting them. I had the upper hand now, and when the truth's on your side, you don't shout, you wait. The next morning, I got a call from Nate, my lawyer friend. His voice had that amused edge it always got when karma started working overtime. "You made the paper," he said. "Front page of the County Gazette. Sheriff's land at center of HOA scandal." I laughed. "Guess they finally found a better headline than Lost Dog found at diner." He chuckled. "They also mentioned the county's recommending the HOA board members step down pending investigation." That made me pause. "Step down?" "Yep," he said. "Apparently they violated about 6 separate sections of county code. It's bad. Really bad." I thanked him, hung up, and looked out over the lake again. The air was crisp, birds flitting through the reeds, but across the water, the once busy clubhouse sat eerily quiet. No cars, no voices, no music. Just stillness. By evening, Karen herself showed up. Her SUV pulled up to the edge of my drive, tires crunching on gravel, and she stepped out slowly, like a queen who'd lost her crown but still wanted to pretend she hadn't. She walked up to the porch, keeping her chin high. "Sheriff," she said, "I think we've all had enough of this hostility." I said nothing, just waited. She shifted her stance. "The board is willing to negotiate. Perhaps we could reach some sort of understanding about shared access." I sipped my coffee, watching her squirm. "Shared access," I repeated. "You mean after you built on my land, threw parties, and filed complaints to evict me?" She forced a brittle smile. "It was a misunderstanding." I nodded slowly. "And this misunderstanding cost the HOA about 40 grand in fines, from what I heard." Her face twitched. "That's exaggerated." I leaned forward slightly. "No, Karen, what's exaggerated is your belief that you can talk your way out of consequences." She didn't have an answer for that. She just stood there for a long moment, then said quietly, "You'll regret embarrassing my family like this." I smiled. "The law embarrassed you. I just watched." She left without another word, her tires spitting gravel as she drove off into the night. I sat there for a while longer, listening to the crickets, the soft lap of water against the dock, the sounds of peace returning to a place that had nearly lost it. I thought about my father again, about how he used to say that justice always walks, never runs, but it always arrives. He was right. It had arrived here, at this lake, where arrogance had tried to build an empire and instead built its own downfall. As the moon climbed over the trees, I felt something I hadn't in weeks, a calm so deep it almost hurt. The lake belonged to the quiet again, and so did I. Tomorrow, the paperwork would finish it. But tonight, the victory was in the silence, and it was enough. 2 weeks later, the courthouse was busier than I'd seen it in years. The day of the hearing had finally arrived, and it felt like the entire county had shown up just to see what kind of spectacle the HOA would make of themselves. I parked my truck out front, the morning sun glaring off the hood, and as I stepped out, I could already hear murmurs inside. Everyone knew about it. The sheriff versus the HOA. It wasn't just a property case anymore. It had become a local legend, something people whispered about at diners and gas stations. I walked through the courthouse doors carrying a leather folder under my arm, the one filled with every document, map, and photograph I'd gathered. The place smelled like coffee and old wood, the way justice should smell. When I stepped into the courtroom, the noise dropped for half a heartbeat before swelling again like the sound of a restless tide. Karen was sitting in the front row with her son and 3 HOA board members. They were dressed like they were attending a charity gala instead of a hearing, polished, rehearsed, and painfully confident for people about to lose everything. Her son avoided eye contact, flipping through his notes like a man trying to memorize excuses before the bell rings. The judge entered, old but sharp, a man who'd probably seen more petty disputes than anyone deserved to. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the room, and said, "Let's get started." Karen's attorney, a city lawyer she'd likely overpaid, stood first. He launched into a long, pompous speech about community development, historical oversight, and shared stewardship of resources. It sounded like he'd copied it straight from a real estate brochure. Every time he mentioned the phrase Lakeview Community, Karen nodded proudly as if she were leading a movement instead of defending trespassing charges. When he finished, the judge looked unimpressed. "Sheriff, I assume you'll be representing yourself?" he asked. I stood, nodded, and said, "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the facts speak well enough." He motioned for me to proceed. I walked to the front, set the folder down on the table, and opened it slowly. The first sound I made was the click of a binder clasp, and in that silence you could feel the tension. "Your Honor," I began, "this isn't a matter of shared stewardship or community development. This is about private property, registered under the county's jurisdiction since 1958. My family has maintained legal ownership of the land on the north shore of Lakeview for over 60 years. The HOA has repeatedly claimed and built on that land without permission, and I have here every piece of proof the county has ever filed." I handed the first set of documents to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. He skimmed through them, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read the signatures and stamp. Karen's lawyer tried to interrupt, saying something about outdated filings, but the judge waved him off. I continued. "Not only did they build without consent, but they also installed electrical connections using my power line, held unauthorized events, and distributed public statements labeling me a trespasser on my own property. I've got video footage, inspection reports, and signed county surveys confirming every one of those actions." I handed over the second folder, this one containing photos. Karen's son installing signs at midnight, the illegal pavilion, the party by the lake. The lawyer tried again to object, claiming the photos were taken without consent, but the judge didn't even look up. "They're on his land," he said simply. Objection overruled. When I finished laying out the evidence, the courtroom was dead quiet except for the creak of the wooden benches. The judge sat back, flipping through the papers like he was reading the final chapter of a book where he already knew the ending. Karen whispered something to her son, but he just stared down at the floor, jaw tight. The judge finally closed the folder, removed his glasses, and looked at her lawyer. "Do you have anything that proves your client's ownership or legal right to occupy this land?" The lawyer hesitated, cleared his throat, and shuffled his papers. "Your Honor, while there may be technical discrepancies, the HOA acted under the belief that—" The judge cut him off. "Belief doesn't replace documentation, Counselor. Do you or do you not have a deed, a survey, or a county record supporting your claim?" The silence that followed said everything. Karen tried to stand, flustered, and said, "Your Honor, the HOA has invested money and time into improving this area for everyone's benefit. It's unfair to punish us for doing what the county failed to clarify." The judge fixed her with a look that could carve stone. "Ma'am, the county didn't fail to clarify anything. You failed to check before you acted. There's a difference." She opened her mouth again, but he held up his hand. "Sit down, Mrs. Collins." Her shoulders dropped like someone had let the air out of her. Then came the verdict. The judge spoke slowly, clearly, so no one could misunderstand. "Based on the evidence provided, the court finds that the Lakeview HOA has encroached upon private property belonging to Sheriff Thomas. All unauthorized structures, including the clubhouse, dock, and pavilion, are to be vacated and removed within 30 days. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to pay fines and restitution for property use and environmental damage. In addition, An injunction is placed prohibiting further activity on that land without express written consent from the owner." He paused, then added, "Frankly, I've never seen a case this straightforward that caused this much trouble." The room erupted in whispers. Some of the HOA members looked ready to bolt. Others sat in stunned silence. Karen's son slammed his folder shut, his face burning red, while Karen just sat there frozen, hands clasped so tight her knuckles went white. The lawyer muttered something about appeals, but even he looked defeated. I stood still for a moment, then nodded to the judge and said, "Thank you, Your Honor." He gave a small nod in return and said, "And Sheriff, good luck cleaning up their mess." The gavel came down, sharp and final, and that was it. Case closed. As I walked out of the courthouse, the air felt different. Lighter, cleaner, like a storm had finally passed. Reporters were waiting outside, but I didn't stop for interviews. I just said, "It's over," and kept walking. Across the parking lot, Karen and her son were arguing, their words carrying just far enough for me to catch the edge of desperation. "You said we could win," she snapped. "You said the bylaws were enough." He shot back, "You told me to handle it. You told me to take control." Their voices tangled into a knot of blame as I reached my truck. For a moment I almost felt sorry for them again, almost. But then I remembered the months of harassment, the letters, the trespassing, the arrogance. No, this ending fit them perfectly. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and glanced once more at the courthouse step. Karen was standing there alone now, shoulders slumped, her perfect image cracking like paint left too long in the sun. She looked across the parking lot at me, eyes full of something between fury and disbelief. I tipped my hat slightly, not out of mockery but out of closure, then drove away. The radio played softly, the road ahead shimmered with heat, and for the first time in weeks, the lake was waiting for me, quiet, calm, and mine again. As I crossed the bridge that curved around the shoreline, I saw the reflection of the water below, still as glass, and thought of what the judge had said. Justice doesn't rush, but when it arrives, it leaves no doubt. The lake shimmered, the sun climbed higher, and behind me, the noise of the courthouse faded into silence. A week after the court ruling, the lake finally looked like it used to before all the noise, before the flyers, before the meetings and megaphones. The mornings were quiet again, the water smooth enough to catch a perfect reflection of the pines and clouds, and the air smelled like pine and dew instead of grilled burgers and ego. The Orange County flags were still up across the shoreline where the HOA once threw their parties, but now the signs flapped alone in the wind, silent reminders of arrogance turned to ash. The clubhouse stood empty, its windows dark, the once polished deck now collecting leaves and dust. Every time I passed by on patrol, I saw the faint outline of where their banners used to hang, the ghosts of their slogans about community spirit, fading in the sunlight. There were no more meetings, no more HOA volunteers marching up and down the road with clipboards, no Karen shouting orders through a megaphone. It felt almost eerie at first, like the aftermath of a storm when the air is too still, but in that stillness was peace, the kind I hadn't felt since the day they'd first shown up with their rules and regulations. The county crews came 2 days later to start dismantling the illegal structures. I watched from my porch as they took down the pavilion, piece by piece, hauling away the tables, cutting through the bolts, pulling up the dock boards that had crossed over my boundary line. The sound of hammering and sawing echoed across the water, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was cleansing, like the lake itself was exhaling. Karen showed up briefly during the teardown, dressed not in her usual pearls and blazer but in plain jeans and a ball cap, her son following a few steps behind with his head down. She didn't say a word to me, not even a glance, but I saw the way her jaw tightened when she watched the workers pulling apart the last section of their beloved dock. She stood there for maybe a minute before turning and walking back toward her car, shoulders stiff, her son trailing after like a shadow. There was no confrontation left in them. No speeches, no threats, no lawsuit. Just silence. Later that evening, as the last truck rolled away and the shoreline returned to what it had been for generations, I walked down to the water with a beer in hand. The sun was setting low, painting the lake in streaks of orange and gold, and the reflection of my cabin glowed warm in the ripples. I thought of my grandfather then, the man who'd built this place with his own hands, who'd said that land only belongs to you as long as you respect it. He'd probably laugh if he saw how hard people had tried to take it without even knowing what it meant. I knelt by the dock, ran my fingers through the cool water, and for the first time in months it felt like home again, uncontested, unpolluted, unclaimed by anyone but me. The loons were calling in the distance, a sound that had been drowned out by music and shouting for too long, and when they echoed across the lake, I knew it was over. The next day, a few of the old locals came by. Ben from the bait shop brought a six-pack, Tina from the diner dropped off a pie, and even Ray, my surveyor friend, stopped in to drop off a new map, freshly printed with the corrected county boundaries and my property lines marked bold as truth. He slapped it on my porch table, grinning. "That's the final version," he said. "No more arguments, no more gray zones. The whole North Shore's officially yours again." I thanked him, offered him a beer, and we sat there in the shade, watching the sun climb over the water. "Funny thing," he said after a while, "people think owning land is about fences and deeds. But it's really about patience. Let the fools make noise, and the truth will wait them out." I nodded. "Yeah," I said quietly. "The truth always does." For a few weeks, the HOA kept sending apology letters, formal ones with stiff language about misunderstandings and miscommunication, but I didn't answer. Some of the residents even stopped by in person, apologizing for going along with Karen's schemes. They weren't bad folks, just people who wanted to belong somewhere, even if it meant following someone who never cared about belonging at all. I told them all the same thing, that the lake was open to everyone as long as they respected the rules of nature and not the nonsense of paperwork. Most of them smiled, relieved, and soon enough the fear that had spread through the community began to fade. They started acting like neighbors again, not members of some self-made kingdom. The fences stayed down, the roads stayed open, and slowly, the place started to feel like a community again. Not an HOA, but a real one. One evening, about a month after the dust had settled, I decided to put up a new sign at the edge of my property. It wasn't big or fancy, just a simple wooden board with hand-painted letters that read, "Sheriff's Lake. Private land, public respect." I hammered it into the ground near the road, wiped the sawdust from my hands, and stood back to look at it. It wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about balance, about reminding everyone that authority means nothing without understanding. The sun was setting when I finished, and as I turned back toward the cabin, I saw headlights in the distance. A car slowed near the sign, paused for a moment, and then rolled on quietly toward town. I didn't need to see who it was. Some things you just know. That night, I sat out on the dock with the lantern glowing softly beside me, the water reflecting the stars. Everything felt right again. No more shouting, no more meetings, no more letters taped to my door. Just the sound of frogs in the reeds and the soft rhythm of the lake. I thought about the irony of it all, that a simple piece of land, a cabin by the water, could expose so much pride, greed, and stupidity. But it also revealed something better, the strength of patience, the value of truth, the quiet satisfaction of watching justice unfold without ever having to shout. The kind of victory that doesn't need applause, only peace. The next morning, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and walked out to the porch as the mist rolled off the water. The smell of pine and earth filled the air. Across the lake, the empty lot where the HOA once held their parties was now nothing but grass and silence. A pair of ducks waddled along the shore where their dock used to stand, claiming it back in their own quiet way. I smiled, raised my mug to them, and took a long sip. The world had reset itself. No banners, no bylaws, no noise, just the lake, the cabin, and the life that was always meant to be there. And as the sun broke through the morning fog, lighting up the water in golden streaks, I finally felt the kind of peace you can't buy or legislate. It's the kind that only comes after standing your ground, not with fists or anger, but with patience, truth, and time. The kind that proves that sometimes you don't need to fight to win, you just need to wait for everyone else to run out of lies. I leaned back against the porch railing, the warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of the lake in my ears, and whispered to the empty horizon, "Welcome back, old friend." Then I smiled, because for the first time in a long time, the lake smiled back.